welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Alex Benitez. I'm the Director of Museums and Tourism for the City of Portsmouth. Today we bring you the third presentation in our 2023 Black History Now lecture series, Pathways of Resistance and Freedom. Some of you are joining us for the third time, so we thank you for coming out again. The weather has been maybe not so challenging, but we've had cold, we've had rain, and the fact that we're all here in numbers means that we're doing something right, and that means sharing our important histories. If you signed up outside for the books, or if you didn't know what you were signing up for outside, I'll tell you right now. We're raffling off 2 copies of Dr. Sayers' book. Real page and then after the presentation, we'll also have a book signing in our Welcome Center. Copies of the book for sale. But we'll do the raffle, and as we did last time, we let the speaker take full responsibility for who wins and who loses this conference. So let me continue. Our presentation today, The Archeology of a Secret World in the Great Dismal Swamp, is by historical archaeologist Dr. Daniel Sayers. Dr. Sayers' presentation is a result of many years of research in our region. And just on a personal note, I first learned of his work many years ago when my own anthropology students, undergraduate students at George Mason University, participated in his field school. So I'm very excited to hear, an update. It's been a few years. And I moved south, so this is especially relevant and interesting to me. Now let me introduce Dr. Daniel Sayers. Dr. Sayers is Associate Professor of Anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C. As a historical archaeologist, he has analyzed and interpreted many archaeological sites across the U.S. through a perspective that emphasizes land and space, economy, the human spirit, and the ways it is enacted in the world across time. He is the author of many academic articles, he has made numerous media appearances, and he has worked with several museums on archaeological exhibits. Sayers is the author of several books, including A Desolate Place for a Defiant People, The Archaeology of Maroons, Indigenous Americans, and Enslaved Laborers of the Great Dismal Swamp. This is the book that we are raffling off today. And also a 2023 published volume titled Archaeology of the Home and the Unhomed, both of which are published by the University Press of Florida. So let me introduce Dr. Daniel Sayers.
Well, thank you all. I hope this is loud enough for you to hear. I'm going to test something here before we go because I tend to wander. Can everyone hear me if I do this? Yes. Okay, good. Good to know. So, and just so you know, this recent book on the homed and the unhomed, recent being it came out, 3 weeks ago? It also has quite a bit on the Great Dismal Swamp, just from a different set of kind of angles and perspectives than you see in the book that is being raffled today, the first book. So anyway, today what I really wanted to talk about was just sort of not just summarizing a solid decade or more's worth of field work in the Dismal Swamp, but also give you a sense, several senses anyway, about why I think anyway this history in the archaeology is so important. It's along the lines that Alex just mentioned, and thank you, Alex, great intro. This human spirit business, I think probably for as long as I can remember, right? We've needed to hear as much as we can in positive as well as critical ways about what goes on when it comes to people being able to enact the things they want and the things that stand in their way, right? Be it socially or even individually, whatever scale you're thinking of, right? But this Dismal Swamp story and the people that sort of help us understand the importance of this wonderful place in our backyard here, right? Why it's so resonant today, resonates so much today, so well today. So hopefully you had time to read the summary here, and thank you for the Cultural Art and Cultural Center for this wonderful opening slide there. But in any case, I give you a little bullet point list here of sort of what I think this story is and this history. Right, we're talking about human dignity, right, being enacted again right here, very, very closely to where we're sitting. Across many centuries and millennia even, of course. Talking about human strength, human self-determination, right? And then the sort of day-to-day business, so to speak, of resisting colonialism, white supremacy, enslavement, Eurocentrism, bigotry, right? A lot of things that are coming up in wider conversations today in the US and certainly globally. Talking about environmental impacts, also a hot conversation point in many circles on any side of the discussion, right? We're talking about really a kind of social revolution. There's a couple twists in that understanding of social revolution, as we'll hear, but nonetheless, right, I think the word or the phrase is relevant for this story. And then this erasure, right? The erasure of Black and Indigenous American histories and really people's lives, okay, of the past, okay? And part of what we're trying to do with the Dismal Swamp Project is not do it perfectly, but rectify some of the problems here that we've seen over the centuries with how historians, archaeologists even, and certainly the wider public has been able to come to understand, right, the histories of this swamp and how they resonate and impacted beyond the swamp, as well as how that world beyond the swamp impacted, right, the history of that landscape. And then finally, I want to emphasize this last almost separated part, and I don't mean that symbolically, I just do it for emphasis, right? It's ancient people. We're talking ancient peoples of the past, indigenous people helping, right, people of the future. And that future that I'm talking about is not just Maroons and indigenous peoples of the swamp after Jamestown and before the Emancipation Proclamation, but even potentially people today and in our future here. So there's quite a bit here, and you'll forgive me in advance if I don't cover every one of these in as much detail as the other. We'll see what I can do. But finally, I also want to emphasize, right, I got to plug my profession a bit, sadly. Right, this is particularly, Alex mentioned that I've worked around the country at many sites, and many archaeologists have, but I'd say in my experience of over 25 years of doing archaeology by now, right, this landscape, the Dismal Swamp itself, in particular, really helps me to think about why archaeology needs to happen, as long as it's done ethically and so on, right? But why does it need to happen in order to understand human pasts? And this is going to, as you'll see, a pretty important example of sort of the case for that anyway. Okay, so just in case, I know we live in the land of archaeology in many ways, but just in case there are those here that don't know necessarily the lingo here of what historical archaeology is, typically people in my sort of sub-discipline of archaeology are going to tell you, right, it's the study of people and related phenomena of the last 500 years or so, okay? So it could be considered, right, the archaeology of people of the modern era, okay? It could be the archaeology of people of that lived under capitalism in the last 450 years or so. There's a lot of different ways people have defined it, but nonetheless, just think for our purposes, 400, 500 years is kind of the time range that this profession or discipline really focuses on typically. Now I have an asterisk there at the end, and that goes back to that statement I just made about ancient people being a big part of this particular story. So for our purposes, we're gonna sort of tweak that definition a bit to say, right, we are not going to exclude any understandings of the ancient past, right, out of pure obligation to focus on the last several centuries, right? But we are going to come to understand some aspects of the modern world, right, with the help of ancient indigenous Americans, especially the things they made in their lives hundreds or thousands of millennia ago, millennia upon millennia ago. So in any case, down here at the bottom, right, the Great Dismal Swamp Landscape Study. That's the name I gave my project. That's something we do in archaeology. I don't know why everything has to have a project name. And it always usually has to be able to be put in an acronym form. So GDSLS for short. But in any case, right, I started it, just so you know, I didn't put it in the opening there, but I went to the College of William and Mary down the road for my doctoral work. This project emerges from that. In fact, it was the core of my dissertation focal point for that degree. But I spent quite a few of my years when at William and Mary doing the field work. A lot of the photos here and artifacts you'll see, right, come from that work. But even after I graduated in 2008, started at American University, and not too long after, about 4 months after graduating, That following summer in '09, I then ran a series annually of field schools, which many may know what they are, but basically they're courses that professors teach students, in which they teach students how to do archaeological excavations, right? They happen all over the place. But I took groups of students and volunteers down for 5 summers starting in '09. So what you're seeing here is the culmination of something like 3 years total of field work, right? If you added it all up across a decade. So about 1/3 of one of the decades of my life was spent actually in the swamp. So, and with other people, of course, quite a bit, but oftentimes alone, especially in the dissertation years. So I have a lot of different angles of interpretation and personal experience with the swamp. But in any case, right, we've been looking at a lot of what you've heard some summaries of already, but the focal point is the people in particular who lived in the Dismal Swamp in more recent centuries. Like I said, roughly after the founding of Jamestown all the way up to the Emancipation Proclamation has generally been my focus. Okay, now I also am aware that many people here may have gone to the swamp, may have been in the swamp, but in case there are those that haven't, I know what it can be like to have something amazing in your backyard. You don't always get to it anyway. I just have a series of photos here just to give us a feel, at least for the kinds of landscapes and the environment around the sites that I worked at, right? The swamp is quite big, as you'll hear about in a minute if you don't know the size statistics on it, but okay. Now this is actually near a place where you can access. You can get a sense along these lines right there at I think this is Washington Ditch, right? In the park there, the walkway there that you can walk, but it's also exemplary of the swamp itself in many ways, especially the Virginia portion. Okay, and then what I'm calling the swamp interior, which is most of the swamp, okay? This is this is the path in to one of the sites we worked at. Those are some students from 2010 or 11. 2-3 feet deep of water, lots of fallen trees, thick canopy in the middle of summer. Very smart move, Sayers. Do archaeological field work at 105 degrees and so ask questions, I'll be glad to elaborate at the end. Okay, just more interior shots. And it's a pretty calm day out there, so if you can't put it together, the bottom's the reflection on the water. There you go, some ripples, there you go. Now you get a sense. Okay, now I also just might as well tell you this landscape. Some would opinions vary a bit. Some would say the swamp today is quite different than it was back before the Civil War and even into ancient times. To an extent, that's true, especially if you go really, really deep in time, thousands of years. But I think it's quite similar in many ways to what the people experienced that we're going to be talking about here today, the people that left behind a lot of the archaeological materials that we'll see some images of, right? And so they did traverse this kind of landscape, even if the trees were a bit bigger because they hadn't been lumbered out 3 times over, etc. Right? It would have still had a similar feel. The water still would have been there. The peat underneath that water that's giving it its really dark color, right? Getting up to 20 feet thick in some parts of the swamp. It's quite a unique sediment itself, Dismal Swamp peat. Okay, so it's very spongy, full of holes, as I can attest to. Run pretty deep, hit you over your head very quickly, and your gear. Okay, hurricanes rolling through, knocking down trees like the one you see here in front. Okay, there's all sorts of natural processes obviously at play that impact the swamp and would impact people that live in that swamp across the centuries of millennia. And of course, the non-human beings that live throughout the swamp, creating part of that amazing ecosystem that the humans that live there certainly did the symbiotic thing in and lived for quite a long period again, as we'll see in a minute. You also have the sort of standout, many may have been in this room, been to Lake Drummond, right? But fear not, it was an important part, right, of the swamp societies across the centuries and millennia, not just for people today who want to get a sense of how the swamp feels and what it is. Okay, but then we have the more contemporary human element, which, right, includes fairly mundane things, but these very long, fairly straight 2-track type roads that parallel canals or ditches that were excavated in more recent decades, but certainly after the Civil War. But a lot of this is 20th century drainage ditching and just sort of water control, land terraforming or landforming. But in any case, flip side is these roads allow people like me and other researchers in the natural sciences, right, to access various points of the otherwise pretty big Dismal Swamp. Okay, water, modern roads. Okay, it's all there. But we also have what's going to be a very incredibly, in fact, I would certainly say, central part of the story here. Okay, out in that swamp, there are in fact little landscape hiccups, right? It's not all beautiful 2-3 foot deep water. You have on occasion islands, right, that crop up outside of that or above that water. And once you're on them, feel very much like any typical woods in a way that you might walk through in the course of your travels in life. Okay, but they're out in the middle of the swamp. We don't know where all of them are. We being the wider world of 75 people, very interested, right, in the Great Dismal Swamp and its natural makeup and its landscape and so on, okay? But we do know where some of them are, okay? At least I can attest to that. I know where they are, but I had help from people that knew them for other reasons other than doing archaeology, okay? And by the way, that image, if the words weren't clear enough, that would be a little snapshot of one such island. Okay, we know where the swamp is. Sorry, some slides you just got to put in out of habit. Okay, but it is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge. At least that's the part of it I worked in. There's the North Carolina State Park as well that's contiguous with it. I didn't work so much there, but certainly in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service properties. That property, the Fish and Wildlife Service Refuge, is something on the order of 190 square miles in size, right? Pretty good size, but even then it's only about 10% of the original. Okay, so it was about 2,000 square miles, and if you see the dotted line there, that's generally where I put the extent of it. Some may quibble at the edges. Oh no, that wasn't really, okay. Most of what I dotted in there was pretty much, when you go back to 1607, 1707, 1807, right, that was pretty much going to be Great Dismal Swamp territory, minus the emergence of Norfolk and a few other places. Okay, so it's pretty big. And that point will matter, not just the fact that it was big, but 2,000 square miles roughly, right, will matter as well. Okay, here is just a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service map. It's, I don't know, 15 years old, something like that. Just to give you a visual of sort of how it's carved up now in terms of ownership and stewardship, right? But also, if you look at the linear dashes and so on, you'll see those are a lot of those canals or ditches I showed you. A 2-track that ran against or ran alongside one. I'm gonna walk over here, sorry. Just to point out, North Carolina, Virginia state line cuts through the Dismal, which is kind of why I'm always going to be talking about both states, and at least periodically. In any case, it just gives you a sense, but also as you can also get a sense where the symbols are, right? Those are some access points for those that just care to visit at some point if you haven't already. The refuge office, Jericho Ditch, Washington Ditch, there's parking lots and such for people to visit. And you can go to the lake as well fairly easily these days. So, whom are we talking about? Okay. Well, any conversation about human history and human societies and cultures is by definition going to be pretty complicated. So a lot of what I have to do in talking about the swamp, right, is sort of distilling what I can, even though we must grant that things are much more complicated, okay? But we have indigenous Americans of a variety of tribal and group backgrounds, right, that are going into the swamp that have long held the swamp in high cultural regard. It was central part of their landscapes. The various groups, those change over time, their dynamic histories in themselves, right? But coming up to this more modern or historic period of starting in 1607 in this region perhaps, right? Certainly we understand that the impact of colonialism, right, after 1607 in particular, right, really compelled a lot of different indigenous peoples right, to go into the swamp. I don't have a number for you from archaeology or from documents. There may be numbers in tribal traditions and so on, but I have yet to hear them. But whatever it is, it's an appreciable number, okay, of people from, again, a variety of backgrounds in what we now call Virginia and North Carolina that would have found the ways, means, and knowledges, right, to go to the swamp, but also survive and live out in the swamp, probably in some great comfort and thrive out there. A little bit later, 1619, the first enslaved Africans brought to, yes, Jamestown yet again. And if we learned anything from Maroon scholarship, which I'll explain in a minute, right? If we learned anything from scholarship about similar groups of people around the hemisphere, the minute people are enslaved, largely for racial and cultural and ethnic reasons, as we saw here, some number among them will maroon, which is to say they will find a way to flee the conditions, remove themselves from the conditions of slavery or enslavement, right? Totally permanently remove, find new places to live away from the yoke and the grasp of thraldom, right? And in that process, as more and more people find those same kinds of places and landscapes, right, communities form, new traditions emerge. And this is an area, by the way, of a pretty complex and long conversation in academic scholarship, as well as some political areas of the modern world, where Maroons and others, similar groups, right, provide symbolic as well as sort of spiritual empowerment, right, by the thought of doing this kind of bold resistance. But in any case, so we know after, again, 1619 would have been sort of ground zero for this process, but not long after, some enslaved Africans would have found their way to the Great Dismal Swamp. And they would have found, of course, people of indigenous background living in the swamp already by that point. And then from then on, as we go through the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, Maroons and others continuously going into the swamp. And the thing is, a lot of them didn't ever leave, okay? But also, of course, a key part of this equation or discussion is going to be white folks or European Americans. And there's a lot to say there, of course, but one thing, I have a quote here for you. I just want to point out how important it is that with a lot of European cultural traditions, there's a deep, when I'm talking about deep time, but also deep-seated fear, loathing, hatred, disgustment, whatever it might be, right? Or disgust at, right? These kinds of wild, uncontrolled, untamed places like our beloved Dismal Swamp. And this certainly holds true going back before the Victorian era into, again, the pre-Civil War, 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, and before. Just think about all the, I don't know, familiar stories to some, right, of Robin Hood, right? And and all the things that went on with sort of outlaws and brigands and so on living out in these deep, deep forests, right, in England and elsewhere, Germany and so on. There's just this built-in fear. And here we have something, a loathing, fear, loathing, whatever, but from 1838, right? And I just, the dots there are just taking out some extraneous verbiage, but basically I'm giving you keywords from this quote of Fanny or Francis Kimball, who visited the swamp in some form or fashion on a trip. Okay, it's a blasted region. Nothing lived or moved. It possesses lonesome solitude. Sunbeams sicken and grow pale as they glided like ghosts. It's impossible that human industry or human wayfaring should ever penetrate. No wholesome growth there. It's slimy depths. It's a wild jungle. It's a rattling cover for venomous reptiles, black ponds, a place forbid. And you can look through all the literature, so to speak, on the Dismal Swamp, all those primary sources from William Byrd II and a bunch of other folks who commented on the impact of the swamp on them by terms of them seeing it or going through it or being on the edges of it. It all sounds pretty similar, okay? And in fact, right, this kind of viewpoint is quite a bit of the reason why so many companies, including those started by George Washington and I believe his brother-in-law or cousin, John Washington, back in the 1760s. Let's get rid of this thing. This thing being the Dismal. Let's drain it. We can make a heck of a lot of money out of it. Turn it over to farmland. There are all sorts of awesome plans from their point of view, right, about transforming that swamp, just like they were doing across the rest of the mid-Atlantic landscape to the extent they could, right? There are all these plans, again, really starting in the early 1700s, but starting to be possible or seem possible by the 1760s, okay? Doesn't mean that's the only reason, but still, this sort of view of these wild places was certainly a motivating factor in all this development attention paid to the Dismal before the Civil War and after. Okay. So there's a lot here. I don't think I'm going to read it all out loud, but nonetheless, right? As I talk, you can check this out, but we have at least four main groups, to think about here. I want you to definitely keep in mind, right, the many millennia that ancient peoples, ancient Native Americans would have lived and exploited the swamp for its resources, to live off of, to feed themselves, to enjoy, to experience, right? It's not all just about survival at any point in time. But come 1607, like I said, an unknown number, at least unknown to me, forced off traditional lands by the processes of colonials and colonialism, right? Living in the swamp. We definitely have records of indigenous groups living along the edges, right? Along, say, the Nansemond Scarp or the Suffolk Scarp. But also, as I can attest, at least from the archaeology, right? Certainly some number lived deeper in the swamp itself. Okay, like I said, 1619 might be our earliest date, but certainly by the 1660, right around 1660 or later, as the race-based slavery system truly cemented itself in this region, and certainly in Virginia, excuse me, all right, we can certainly think at that point that we're talking about a very, very appreciable number of African-American Maroons, okay, who permanently, I say, self-extricate, a little bit of the academic coming out, right, but removing themselves from the brutalities of slavery, its white supremacy, and so on. Okay, now, Maroons, as we know from the records, the documentary records, that's usually what I mean by that. Okay, we see some evidence of Maroons living along the edges of the swamp. Again, the Scarp is a good example, but there are other sort of natural or cultural edges to it. But we also know they lived in the swamp interior. And then a little bit later, as you start looking at group 4, okay, Maroons also start surreptitiously working with the thousands of known enslaved African-American Canal Company workers. Okay, so you can see the span of time here, obviously going back well before Jamestown, all the way up to more or less the beginning of the Civil War and really Emancipation Proclamation. Not too many images out there for us, right? But we do have Osman, a somewhat, again, in certain circles, famous image, right, of a Maroon observed in the Dismal late in the sort of pre-Civil War period. This appeared in Harper's monthly or weekly, I can never remember. But a lot of people read the story that this was found in, right, about the Dismal Swamp, and one writer's journey into the swamp and then back out again happened to run into Osman. And down here is from the imagination of a painter, because by the 19th century, by 1850s, and certainly by 56, right, the Maroons of the Dismal Swamp were certainly a big part of the national and really even international conversation about the horrors of race-based slavery, but also just sort of the story, right, of enslavement and what people did to resist it. And marooning was certainly one of the big processes associated with that. So images aside, we also don't have a lot of documentation. So for historians, right, they often do their best to get the kinds of information they need from a very scant documentary record. Here's one that I stumbled into by good fortune. Many years ago. It is now, I think, at University of Virginia, but I found it at a bookseller's place in Williamsburg, right down from where I lived then, before UVA bought it. or whatever they got it somehow, okay? This is one of the few detailed discussions of a maroon living in the Dismal. And this is really priceless. Okay, this is like historians and archaeologists equivalent of finding gold in the documents, especially in this case, okay? Because we not only get a sense of the long term, we don't know why this person left the swamp. Given the date of the record, it could be they joined the British. This is from the late 18th century. The British Emancipation Proclamation may have drawn them out. It's not mine, is it? No, okay. But whatever drew this maroon out from the swamp, what we know is he raised rice and grains and made chairs, tables, and musical instruments. But I know if I was living alone in a swamp, I couldn't help but make several instruments for myself. I'd want a lot of tables and furniture because, hell, what else do I have to do, right? Make furniture and sit around or do whatever. No, I think what we're seeing here is, as would be expected perhaps, the maroon comes out. His white interlocutors, who are, by the way, pretty wealthy elites, who are some of the early canal and lumber company sort of executive types, entrepreneurs. He's talking to either one of them or one of their sort of right-hand men. And so he's not going to betray the fact that there are others out there who he's left. Rather, he just comes up with, I was out there. Yeah, that's what I did. And I can see the grilling. How'd you live out there? Well, I raised grains. And how'd you pass the time? Well, I made furniture. And so on. But I think this is just a little clue that, yes, we definitely have one of our early, only glimpses, in a sense, in a primary document like this of a maroon, but much less than hints, even more than hints, certainly indications that there were more maroons out there than him. He just happened to come out again for whatever reasons, no doubt good ones. Okay, same article that gave us Osman. We have also drawings of the enslaved company worker settlement. In this case, it's right along Jericho Ditch, right? Not too far from here. The workers there called it horse camp. Okay, but again, we take what we can get here, and these are drawings, first-hand drawings by the author, at least one little part of an enslaved company worker settlement. Oops. And some things really didn't change a lot. You go into the early 20th century, find early 1905 postcards showing African-American workers in the Dismal. The technology may have changed a bit. A little bit of the industrial age coming through now than maybe it was 100 years earlier, 50 years earlier, whatever. But nonetheless, right? Life still went on in the swamp. Things still went on in the swamp that involved human beings after the Emancipation Proclamation, but there are also certainly some big changes that went with that. So that's what I have for you for a quick background. I can elaborate when we have any time for questions a bit later, but let's move a little bit here in the direction of thinking, okay, Sayers, let's take his word for it. He gave us a fairly good range of examples of what we know from the documents, but we also know Sayers is an anthropologist. He is an archaeologist, but I'm in the Department of Anthro for a reason at AU, and I would be at any university here in the States. We archaeologists are eager to find out a bit more about people than just sort of facts and dates and so on. We need those things, but we also need to understand something about societies, cultures, economics, right? Their economies, their way of living, all these, there's a lot of things of interest to us. And certainly also goes, obviously, then for archaeology. What can archaeology tell us, right, that we can't get from the documents? Like I said, it just turns out we can't get a heck of a lot from the documents. So, wow, I think we really need archaeology here in this case. So the first survey, like I mentioned, I started the project in 2001, very early in my tenure at William & Mary. That involved going and getting a lot of different permissions, getting my federal permit, getting that in motion anyway, the application process to work on federal property as an archaeologist. I also had to do the archival work, okay, back in 01, 02, look at what other historians had written, local as well as national historians, what everyone kind of knew. So you do a lot of background work before you go out into the field and do any excavating, ideally anyway. But by the fall of 03, Hurricane Isabel had roared through here, you may remember, some of you. And it turned out a lot of the sort of eye or whatever of the hurricane went right over the Dismal. And there I was, the day Isabel was roaring through. I mean, I was literally, it was supposed to be like that day I go out to the Dismal for my first work. Thanks. But in any case, hurricanes aside, I think it was a month later, maybe it was 6 weeks, I was able to get out there in the fall of '03 and start my work. This comes a little later, these images. Okay, maybe late 2003, but one of the things that happened, long story short, is after the fall of '03 doing survey work, guided by a variety of boring things I won't drone on about, but some predictions I had in my head about where sites would be, right? Finally ended up getting info from people such as refuge employees and scientists who've been out in the swamp about the location of some of these islands that the documents suggested might exist out there. So these images are actually from survey of an island out in the swamp. It happens to be in North Carolina. Okay, but what you're seeing here is a big part of our survey strategy, because when I say our, it's me. And there you go on the left, that's Aaron in the pink or whatever shirt that is, or sweatshirt. So more often than not, it was two of us. Quite often it was one of us. And so you can't do a lot of, you can do some excavating, but you can't do a lot of it, right, reasonably well as a one person. So turned out that Isabel had, like I said, roared through. So Isabel also knocked down a lot of trees. And what you're seeing here actually, sorry, in case it's not clear, okay, Aaron is taller than me. I think Aaron's about 6'4". Okay, so the tree fell over away from view here. That's the root ball, effectively. Going vertically up, so I call it, again, we make stuff up here in academia a little bit, labels in particular, tree root mass survey, right? TRM survey became a pretty indispensable part of us going out and saying, okay, we found islands. We have no knowledge if people were here at all. Sayers thinks there were, but we have no actual knowledge of this. So how do we demonstrate people were here at any point? And so the tree falls allowed us to record location of artifacts, collect the artifacts, let the Fish and Wildlife Service know through report writing and so on that there were presences of artifacts, or not, depending on the situation. But in this case, when you go onto an island out in the swamp, these tree falls quite often, not to say 100% of the time, but quite often yielded some artifact materials. Okay, some of it was quite ancient. Tree fall, vertical face again, but here you walk up to one and you see several fragments of steatite or soapstone vessels. The tree had grown over them, so to speak. And then in this case, there was this, but also a bunch of, quite a few sherds of ceramic. So we excavated, kind of reverse excavation into the tree mass, particularly with the Fish and Wildlife Service being interested in, right, collecting as much info as we could from these already disturbed locations. The tree falling is considered a disturbance. Okay, again, just some overviews of these living areas, i.e. islands. And again, they're not, if you just were planted there, right, just suddenly found yourself there, you'd think you were in the woods, basically, okay? Okay. So here is a few slides, a few images and a little bit of discussion, excuse me, on an enslaved company worker settlement. Now, one of the things here I'm trying to do, and I just want you to know, kind of what do they say, that full disclosure, being a public forum, I can't really tell you exactly where the sites are, okay? For site protection and so on, I trust every one of you, but especially because we're filming, you never know. And sites are always in danger of people going in who don't know necessarily what they're doing archaeologically and digging into the ground and taking things from them. In this case, it'd be illegal too because it's federal property, but nonetheless, shockingly, some people break the law. Didn't want to surprise you, but it happens. And so we got to be particularly careful about that. But it is, trust me, this is an 1820. This canal was excavated by enslaved labor in the 1815 to 20 range, which means once the canal was excavated, water's flowing through it. The canals are used to move people and boats and goods back and forth from here to Norfolk and the other place. Okay, that means we had enslaved company workers, right, living along the canal at some point, just like we saw along Jericho. So it turns out that this canal was cut through a pretty good sized island. Now, if you're doing that and you're out there in 1815 or 16 or 17, you're a mile and a half into the swamp and you're digging and suddenly there's an island that you're digging through instead of the peat and you go, geez, well, if we're gonna live somewhere, why not right here on the island, right? This thing's cut right through it. So, and by the way, that's like 15 feet wide just for scale. And we crossed that tree. I think I'm taking the photo from the tree there. That was our way. The island's kind of not cut in half, but there's a third of it on the north side of the canal and most of it's on the south side. So I went to the south side, well, both sides, but this is now, so here's the canal here on this side. Here's the parallel road, which in this case is the spoils. When they're digging these things, they're throwing that muck and dirt and sand somewhere, creating this sort of side road or side trail along the canal. This isn't today, of course. That's me and a couple of my archaeology dissertation advisors. So 15 feet, I don't know, 20 from south of that canal we just saw a photo of. We're looking at a tree fall that's just outside the photo here in the left, lower left, and I find a little pinky-sized fragment of what I know pretty instantly is mid-19th century or earlier transfer print, which is a very common kind of ceramic vessel. You still see them in antique stores all over the place. Many of you probably have examples in your cupboard still or as heirlooms. Well, I found a little piece of that in a tree fall, dug some small shovel test exploratory units right nearby, end up finding quite a bit of it. I have a photo in a minute. But we found so much of this 1820s ceramic vessel that I was like, whoa, we're onto something, right? So we expanded. This is, by the way, again, forgive me if I'm stating the obvious, but all along here where you see the flags on the edge, okay, unexcavated outside that, but inside here is the excavation itself, going down something like 4 inches, 3 inches, depending on the soil's mood. Okay, and what you're seeing here, and I can give you the straight up here, is if it's dark soil at this point, it's really interesting. People disturb something there. If it's getting more tan, an orangish tan, doesn't mean it's uninteresting, it's just not as disturbed, and maybe not even disturbed at all. But it was still, because it's so close, it was part of where people were. But in that really dark soil there, we know there was a fairly substantial disturbance. Okay. So we end up finding like pretty much within maybe a square foot area. It was broken into pieces. This is one of the biggest, but we found the whole bowl, basically. So it broke probably after the 1820s, 30s, 40s in place, spread out a little bit through natural processes. Bear in mind, we're like a mile and a half into a swamp. What the heck's this doing there? It was a rare item then, right? If this was full in an antique store right now, it'd be pretty expensive, right? It was because of the rarity even then. Certainly rare now. In association with that, nothing surprising here. Nails, right? We have a whiskey or an alcohol flask bottle fragment. We have a little patent medicine or medicine bottle fragment there, all pre-1850. Nails as well. So here's a little summary. In addition to those, right, animal bones from domestic animals, mostly a few wild, the species that they ate. Some knife parts, knife blades. A couple fragments of locally made tobacco pipe, particularly bowls. They're called pamphlet pipes, for those in the familiar. Okay, quite a few artifacts, and that was a pretty small area, 9 square meter excavation, plus the bowl and the fragments that were once the full bowl. Okay, so long story short, I think what we saw there, the dark soil that I showed you was part of, not to say the whole, but part of an enslaved company worker, probably a barracks type place. That's somewhat interpretive, but nonetheless, okay, but there were a lot of possessions there, all concentrated in that sort of spot where the bowl sort of clued me into. Okay, I think it was probably a little storage spot, even maybe a stash spot in the ground inside the barracks. Okay, and then the building itself, somewhere along the way, burnt in place and fell over everything. There's a lot of charcoal in there, in the soil mix, okay? But what we also know from what we recovered is that, okay, that island was not devoid of humans when the enslaved company workers were digging that canal through and then put the settlement or their workspaces and buildings down. Okay, so every once in a while I find in those brown or tan soils an association, maybe even mixed in with that dark soil because they were digging into the ground and mixing it up, bringing old things into the soils that they were creating today in 1820, whatever it may be, finding artifacts that date to the 1600s, date to the early 1700s. Not many, but a few. Okay, just a reminder, all right, that wherever we are, whether it's in 1850 or 1900 or 2023, wherever we're standing and rooting around with our shovels or our backhoes for construction, we're always kind of where someone else was before us. Okay, in this case, right, they may have pretty much chased the folks who were living on this island off by way of threat, whether intentionally or not, right? People who were living there already by the 1815 or the year 1815 or so, already living there for a couple hundred years, if not longer. Moving along. Okay, now we move also to a different part of the refuge, and as you see here, hopefully it makes sense. I have the circle around one island site that I worked at a lot, okay? But the other shapes look kind of similar here, kind of amorphous. Those are also islands. So this is an archipelago, if I may, right, of islands in the swamp, with apologies to Dolly and Kenny. Okay, so we have actually visited those two, in addition to the circled one. The other ones remain unexplored, or at least archaeologically speaking, which is what I'm usually doing in talking about the swamp, remain unexplored by us in the profession. Okay, but that's about 18 to 20 acres, that being the circled one. So right there in about 1.5 miles linear-wise, but say a couple square miles total, there's a lot of dry ground right there, a lot of island. So 80, 100 acres maybe. So here we are going about the business of excavating at that island that was circled. Just to give us a sense that people are involved yesterday and today. We had to haul all that out there. Getting out here involved a walk of a couple thousand feet, 15 or 2,500 feet in the water usually. And if we were unlucky, the water was low and we were in mud and muck for 7 weeks, walking in and out. Big fun. Cherish every memory. Okay, so on to the business. So this was back, now we go back to my dissertation work of 03 to 06. Okay, one of the first things I really looked at, now this is 29 square meters. It's a weird shaped block, of course. I was following the breadcrumbs a little bit with the shape here, but nonetheless, in the back, particularly, I know I have a pointer, but it's easier just to do this. I'll give you a close-up of that, but that was really the first epiphanous almost moment that we were onto something in those excavations. There's Brendan helped me out, Brendan Burke, who I believe now is our state underwater archaeologist in Virginia. But back then, Brendan was an able-bodied volunteer, and he's helped me excavate that back part, which I think I have a photo for you. Boy, might be, there you go. So that's the back of that block, and it's a little glimpse of a much larger post-in-ground cabin structure. And where the intersecting lines, and yes, I provided those, I did not see those in the ground. Where they intersect more or less is where a post was placed. So it's a fairly grid-like pattern, so you imagine they're raised, I'm gonna guess, based on some similar structures elsewhere. And it's a swamp, 1.5 feet, 2 feet off the ground. You got the floor laid out horizontally, of course, and the structure on top. So you're gonna have 1.5 feet or 2 feet underneath, potentially. Things fall through the cracks in the floor because this is all hand-hewn wood. And even if it wasn't, you still have stuff falling through. But nonetheless, okay? We took some fancy dates. This cabin footprint comes in the 1600s. The arrows are actually there on the white arrows and so on. Those were there, so you know. Oh, and then just a little human element beyond that. This is probably a replacement post. Notice how it's off grid. So probably one of the original posts rots out. Someone gets under there and puts one up, but it's not certainly on the grid. Okay, again, popping around the island with my excavation tools and a plan of sorts, finding architectural features all over the place. Here is a much smaller excavation area, 1 meter by 4, I think. But where I put the lines, again, a little bit less artfully done this time, okay, is sort of one of the, to the left of, it's hard to explain my language after all these years. Entry, right, door. Then over here we see to the left of the door, or the right, whichever way you're looking, then we've got the corner of the house coming down this way. All the labeling there is from the computer, but nonetheless, right, it was very hard, very compacted underneath, like someone intentionally heated it, where they dug a little bit of a trench to put the posts that were going to be vertical, raising their structure up. The dark soil, again, is always something, in this case, always something to do with human activity. Now it's weird, this photo is always funny. Sometimes I can see it very clearly on a computer, sometimes I can't. I don't know what you can see, but this is a fire pit. Okay? When I see it clearly on my computer, this side's really clear, this half, okay? But I don't know what it looks like to you all out there. But you have to trust me. It's a fire pit. And this was not detected by old eagle eyes here. Okay, this was actually detected by, I was mocking myself, eagle eyes. I just got my reading glasses last summer, still getting used to them. What was I just thinking? Oh yeah, so we did use some fancy tech, right? You may be familiar with geophysical survey and research and techniques, right? So one of the one of the techniques, right, detects the signature of fire pits specifically, very clearly. Very well known to experts in that branch of science. And so this popped up on the computer screen. My geophys guy was looking and said, oh, there's a fire pit right here. So we dug, we found it, excavated some of it, and it dates to the 1630s or so, on the same site. Now we go to another part of that 20-acre island. Put a shovel in the ground initially, dig a small unit. That's what this is, the big chunk out of the middle. It was quite interesting, as you'll see in a second, but it compelled us to excavate even further than that, and so that's why we excavated the larger block. Just so you know, that white and black rod up in the upper right, that's 1 meter long. Okay, and on the right side, again, dark soil means human stuff. Here, you see the edge of the structure. This is another grid pattern, grid floor plan, grid posted, right? Post and ground structure, raised off the ground. And out here, this is the edge, right? One of the sides of the house. A little disturbed soil here. Here's a big tree root. Then it gets really cleared up here. Very little signs of disturbance. What's in that unit? The part that's dug a little deeper. Wow, look at that. Okay, so one of the posts, you dig a hole, you put a post in, right? You disturb the soil by doing that. The post then rots in the ground. Let's just say that. The rotting post turns darker soil eventually, right? We see it in the ground because it contrasts with the orange. That's what we saw there. But in this case, when we got down to where it's really contrasting with the orange, archaeologist Lance Green there, this is AU times now. He joined me as one of my colleagues for those few years. He sees ceramic potsherds in the post soil itself. And as he excavates it, he starts to see that whoever built this constructed this cabin lined the post with these ceramic sherds. It's kind of unusual, guys. It's really interesting archaeologically. Doesn't mean it's never been found elsewhere, but you don't find it every day like that. So when we excavated as meticulously as possible, we did remove the potsherds from one half of the post. The remaining half is still there. We didn't take it all out by any stretch. But what we did pull out, most of them came together, as in conjoined is what we call it, right? They're conjoinable fragments. This is now washed up and sitting in our lab in the photo box. You take a photo, you can see, right? Pretty good sized chunk of a much larger pot. About yay thick, about 1/2 inch thick sherds. Lance, the fellow who excavated it, helped identify them as Croker landing ceramic. It's a style that's very old. It's among the oldest in the region, going back a few thousand years for sure, like three, 4, depending on who you talk to. But in the soils that we excavated all around that cabin, right, look what else we found. Okay, iron fragments, lead shots, white clay tobacco pipe fragments, probably dating to that range. Stone flakes, some clear glass chips, little guys. So we know, right, we have 3,000 or so year old ceramic in a post, and then we're finding all this more modern or more recent material in association with it. It's a conundrum. Lance was convinced it was an ancient pre-contact site or feature. Because of the historic material, I was not convinced, and in fact, this is exactly what I predicted we'd find, this kind of thing when it came to maroons and swamp resistance communities that included maroons and indigenous peoples. Oops, thought I had another one. So what ends up happening here then is we do some fancy dating in a lab out in Washington by taking some sand samples, and the date from that feature comes in around 1730. Okay? From that, when I say that feature, I mean that cabin was built somewhere around 1730, not 3,000 years ago. So I said, ha ha, Lance, you were wrong. He said, I'll be darned. So, okay, last but not least, same site. Again, I'm kind of popping you all over this 18-acre island, but that's what we did, so you get the fun of trying to follow it. Okay, now we're at the highest point of the island. It's a full story, 10 feet above swamp level, okay? And on the highest point of the island, we find the most unusual architectural signature I had seen in all those years. This was a little toward the end of the research fieldwork I mentioned. I think summer of 2011 is when we found this, 12. And those half excavated look like sort of half circle pits or units, right? Those were stash pits. Okay, so there's a bunch of info we got archaeologically that we uncovered that helped me. But that difference of structure and architecture in a way is a big part of this, but not only. And it's the high point of the island. This is probably a community defense structure. So it's not going to look like the post and ground home cabins and so on that we saw in many other parts. This is sort of serving a different purpose in the community. The materials and so on that we found date to this range you see on the bottom, late or 1775 or so, all the way to the Emancipation Proclamation. Sorry. So what are the kinds of artifacts we're finding outside of what I've already shown you? Okay. People finding the occasional outside world materials like a clear glass bottle and making use of it. Right, in this bottom piece, right? Making a tool of some kind. Chip some glass, right? Whack it with this and create a sharp edge. As you don't need to work too hard with glass, as most of us know, if not all of us. Glass tends to be sharp, but nonetheless, right, we're seeing debris just like we do from stone tools from, right, things like glass bottles. We have curious indentations in stone. This is just an interpretation, but right, potentially something like an arrow shaft smoothing stone. Okay, over here, and I want you to really pay attention if I may sound that way, but it's important. On the left, right, a well-known type among archaeologists anyway, right, of projectile point going back a long time. BP means before present. So 44,500 years or older, a Marl Mountain 2 was the type. Don't worry about it. Okay, but somewhere along the way, namely in about 1650 or so, someone on that island reworked one side of it. Okay, they reworked it into a scraper or some kind of knife blade. And that scraper side I've pointed you to there, it's the historically modified side. We saw 8 or 9 examples just from this island of similar kinds of approaches to ancient tools. Okay, but we also found things like, especially when we start seeing the end of the 18th century into the 19th, those contexts, right? Start to find a bit more of this outside world stuff. Biconal bead, right? Same archaeologist, Lance, good buddy of mine these days, right? He's from Ohio. He found what he thought was a similar looking bead in one of his flea markets there outside over Dayton. Yeah. Okay. Kind of see here it's scalloped on both sides. See that little seam there? That's copper. We did some, again, lab stuff. It's never me. It's always people on the project interested in using tech. I'm a Luddite. But she ran that through some kind of test in Dismal, and it's iron and copper and a little bit of nickel or some such quantity of metals. So it's definitely not a natural thing as it occurs naturally. But beyond that, right, burnt clay. That's over in the right here, burnt clay pieces associated with the cabins quite often, right? Lead shot, more of these are the white clay tobacco pipe fragments. Just a couple of them. Over there, a late 1700s green wine bottle fragment. Lead shot up in the upper left, and then way in the upper part of that upper left photo, you have some pieces of British gunflint chip. Chips. Okay. So what is this all saying? Well, I want to say one thing, and I'm losing track of time here. Hopefully we have a few more minutes. One of the key things to think about is you're out in the swamp, you're forming these communities, you're really going out there for the reasons that you want to remove yourself permanently. That world's bad out there. I want nothing more to do with it. We're going to stay out here. You're forming communities. Kids are being born. New people are coming in. All long generations. Right? You're going to run to the market every week. You're going to go out into the farmland and raid windowsills every 3 weeks to get food. You might if you had to, but in this case, I think what we're seeing is people living up to their self-standard here, right? We're going out there, we are removing as much as possible ourselves from the outside world. There are probably community rules in place for those that wanted to lapse a bit and run out and do something, get whatever they thought they needed. So they came up with ways to survive, obviously. They fed themselves. They found material culture. They made material culture for themselves, all these things and more. But when they do have things like an ancient stone tool that they are finding in the ground, just like I do a bit later, right? And they need to rework it, they're going to be working these things down to nothing, right? Like think whittling, right? If you only had one piece of wood and you're just a diehard whittler, you're not going to throw it away when you got 3 inches left of it. You're going to keep whittling and do something with it. Okay, so when you have an ancient stone tool or whatever it may be, you're going to keep using it. I don't need a knife anymore. I need something else. I need like an awl, right, to punch this hide or do whatever. Whittle more, flakes of stone fly off. And the thing about what I found out there, I just showed you was it's biased towards big things and to an extent somewhat familiar things. The vast majority of artifacts I found in the remote interior island, several thousand artifacts, most were smaller than a couple millimeters in their widest dimension. When I say most, I mean 70%, 80%. And 20% more of the remainder is going to be pretty small by most standards, 10, 15 millimeters in size. And I think this reflects a lot of this fact they're using things to the utmost, be it ancient tools or ancient ceramics and so on. Okay? Now, hopefully somebody is saying, yeah, but you just showed us pictures of big artifacts. I'll get to that in a minute. It's a great point. Okay, so the Dismal Swamp was home to, this is where I'm coming from in terms of my final analysis. And yes, you will find a lot of this in the book here. It's just in pretty bad academic prose, but I had to do that, sorry. Had to get tenure. Okay, but the Dismal Swamp was home to many people. Many thousands of people, I might say, across a century and change, and really I'll say a century and a half and change. In fact, I argued that these are multi-generational communities, at least in the interior. I can argue that from archaeological evidence, a little bit indirectly, but it's pretty good reasoning behind it. The swamp world itself, the social world that was largely defined by the swamp, certainly connected to the outside world, especially with the canal companies and the workers and so on, commodities that flowed through it from merchants outside the swamp. But nonetheless, right, it was its own world as well in many ways, and that lasted longer. We're getting close now, but longer than we've been in the United States. Okay, they lived permanently in the interior areas, like I said, or at least implied. Okay, and after 1800, okay, we see the rise of the new kinds of communities associated with those enslaved company workers, which we've worked at a few of their sites in the project. Okay, but the interior communities, I have my fancy word again, scission. Just think scissors, think cutting yourself off, right? These communities that are trying to cut themselves off from the world outside, those are going to be all across the interior. Then you have the enslaved company settlements and communities, like I said. They're using remarkably different, am I doing that? Okay, I'll keep my hand down. Not sure if it was that. Okay, thank you. So, what I saw, you might have even sensed it yourself, the contrast a little bit you could see between the kinds of material things people used in the enslaved company worker along the settlement along the canal versus what we saw in the interior. It's the ones along the canal, to put it simply, are a lot more like your typical historical site, right? Ceramics, glass, iron, knives, a little bit of illicit activity potentially with some whiskey drinking, woo, right? So, but the material culture of the modern age with its mass production tends to reflect this kind of thing, right? We just see it all over the place. It's par for the course. Inside, same exact age or somewhere around there, right? We're seeing people using a whole different range of materials. We know trade systems thrived in the swamp. Think we call them informal economies, but underground economies. Few things somehow go missing off one of the boats going along the canal, and then it ends up in a canal company settlement. They trade it to people in the interior or to another settlement. This kind of thing goes on. And so artifacts are circulating around the swamp for quite a few centuries there, and then the outside world stuff starts to pop up a bit more across the swamp after the rise of the canal companies. Some of this is getting into the weeds a bit given their time limitations, but nonetheless, I was able to elaborate a little bit, right, on some of the anthro things, if I may, that we tend to be interested in. Okay, I think they were organized around families, kin groups. Some families were older than others, had spent more time, were sort of figurehead types perhaps of some sort in the communities. There may have been rank associated with that, may not, but it's possible. It happens in other situations. I think they were heavily populated. Those islands probably each, the ones in North Carolina on the archipelago, probably at any given point had a couple hundred people each, if not a few more. In the heyday anyway, which was up till about 1800. I think they were multi-generational, like I said. This is a point I do want to bring home. This comes back to what I said in one of the opening slides about people of the past helping people of the future. Okay, the ancient people's material culture wasn't just like a neat little addition to the way of life out there. Okay, interior resistance communities needed those people of the past. They needed them to survive. They needed them to make sense of the place, right? The islands and so on. And it also gave them, I think, some form, and you can choose your own word here, but I'm just going to say it for something in a way that we all kind of understand, I hope, right? It gave them some kind of comfort. A reassurance, right, that people of ancient days, now they weren't archaeologists living there in 1700 or whatever, they'd had different names for it. It might have been ancestors, it might have been the ancient ones, it might have been whatever. But they knew people were there before them. They found their tools right there where they were digging, planting whatever cotton they were planting or whatever it might be for their use in their community. And they were appreciative. They were thankful that those tools were there. And it's really actually in its way, it depends on if you let it get to you, it's kind of profound in its way. And this is why I think we found the occasional, not whittled down to nothing projectile point. Every one of those tools I found was found in the dark soils of a cabin footprint. Okay? So I think what happened was that somebody was building a house, cabin, raise it up, they're getting ready to do whatever, dig the hole, they've dug the hole, whatever it might be, and they find an old tool, they imprint a little bit of themselves on it by whittling away one side. And they intentionally place it in the cabin footprint. And then it becomes sort of in their mind, right, a physical way to connect the house, the home they made here, or they're gonna make in this house, with an ancient one and the support the ancient people gave them for them to press on into their future, and they're part of that. That's why they imprint a little bit of themselves on it. That would be known as interpretation. Okay, but I went there in my book. But I do, and there's some groundwork laid in archaeology and other contexts for those kinds of interpretations, and I thought, why not? That's how it hits me, that's how I understand it, and it helps me explain an anomaly. Why those 8 or 9 arrowheads weren't whittled down to nothing when I know every other one was. And why am I finding them in cabin footprints? So in any case, just bear in mind, I know I'm down to virtually nothing, if not past, but we do know a period of change was afoot once the canal company kind of whirled, invaded the swamp. And there'd be more on that in question and answer if you want, but it was transformative, meaning communities across the swamp changed, certainly formed, but then changed in certain ways, not to say entirely. I want to close with a little bit, and it'll be very quick, a little bit just about a few things to do with sort of public archaeology. Again, I can always provide more. I'm just really happy to know, or to have been part of even, right? Some of the things, since 2001 when I started, my part of the work and so on, right? Just seeing changes about how the public understands this amazing place and these amazing people of the swamp. When I started, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had virtually no built-in recognition of the human history, the cultural history of that swamp. It was a heck of a lot of appreciation for the natural, right? But not a lot about the human history, especially going back before the 20th century. Okay, so a lot of us working since the turn of the millennium, I think, really contributed to raising the awareness just there in the stewarding body of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Dismal Swamp, right? Awareness of the human history of the swamp, its ancientness as well as its pre-Civil War people. And here we contributed, a lot of us, right, to a public historical interpretation panel that was, I think it's been 10 years now since the pavilion this is in went up. It's part of the wider Network to Freedom. Okay, I was able to work with the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture to develop a permanent exhibit. They were quite fascinated by what I just told you about the relative size of artifacts and all this stuff and what it means and so on. And so they came up with this way of representing some of the archaeology and the people of the swamp. I'm not sure I would have chosen this, but you know, teach their own, and these are curators, and they had a really good set of ideas. And so here is just really a lucite sort of tray or whatever you want to call it, right, with select artifacts from the swamp interior. And been working on and off in various intensity going up and down, but nonetheless always interested in, speaking for myself, right, in the work of rest in peace, Senator McKeechin, right, to help get the Dismal Swamp recognized at the federal level as a historic area. And I believe that has come to fruition as of this last month or so. So you can see his words there. I'll give him a moment to speak, right? But I'll speak for him, because I'm quoting him. The Great Dismal Swamp is an incredibly important historical, archaeological, and environmental site for the Commonwealth. Okay, more recently, a good friend of mine, Eric Shepard, descendant of Moses Grandy, one of the many thousands of enslaved company workers of the 19th century, worked tirelessly with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and others to transform the existing pier that many of you have probably been to, right, into this reflection pier. The plaque itself says it recognizes the contributions of indigenous people, Moses Grandy, the Underground Railroad freedom seekers, Maroons, and supporters for their sacrifice and contributions to American history. Let this pier and lake forever be enjoyed by all people as a place of healing, reflection, and hope, as it was for others seeking refuge before us. Dedicated fairly recently, August 6th, as a matter of fact, it's on the plaque, 2022. So, right, it's just, these are really wonderful things to see happen in the course of 20 years, okay? So I give this to you. This is one of the last slides, sorry. Accessible resources. Take a photo if you have a phone, if you care to. Or check out the film on YouTube or wherever it'll be after. But we've done some work trying to get the word out in a variety of media, right? For just so anyone who's interested can get a sense of what this history is, what the archaeology looked like, and a lot of other things. In honor, respect, and recognition of the indigenous Americans, Black Maroons, and Black enslaved workers of the Great Dismal Swamp from 11,500 years before the Common Era, all the way to 1863, this era, and their descendants of today and the future. And then thanks, of course, Steve Granette and the Portsmouth Art and Cultural Center for the invitation to present. And thank you, Alex. And thanks, of course, to Eric and many others who have helped, advised, been inspirations for, and so on for the project. And of course, previous researchers listed below. Yeah, that's what I got for you. Thank you.
So we're a little bit over on time. It was a great presentation. Thank you so much. So we're just going to take a few questions. So maybe 3 questions if we can get those in.
And since this is being filmed, I'm going to ask anyone with questions to speak into the magic microphone. So just raise your hand, and maybe Alex, if you can. Alex will be my director, or Dr. Sayers will be my director, and I will come to you.
Excellent. Did you find any burial site?
No.
So where did they bury them?
Well, I have a few ideas, but yeah, I'll leave those to myself. Yeah, but no, I think it was definitely a factor of life, needless to say. And when the right people and the right project comes along to go explore, should it ever happen, right? Burial practices and that aspect of these communities in this world, it'll be an amazing thing. But yeah, as it is, no, I did not find anything of that sort. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. You made mention earlier of the fact that a lot of the people that lived there were called Maroons. Where did that term come from? I've heard it had to do with the color of the clay. Did it have to do with the fact that they were maroon? Do you know the origin of that term?
Yeah, there's a few what you call it, schools of thought on that, but it goes back very, very early to Spanish colonization of the islands, the Caribbean islands, and so on. I would say the most common understanding is that it's that ancient. They're alive. It's one of these translation things, but ultimately it means wild ones, uncontrolled ones. But it's coming from ancient indigenous languages, the Taino, way back when. But it's a French. I'm losing track. Either French to English from the indigenous translation, right? But so Cimarron is actually a root word here. So in that case, sort of horse, Mustang, wild. But in any case, yeah. Not by most that I know of, yeah. But there's always a chance. But yeah, at the moment, no, it's still considered quite a positive word and a label in a sense. So yeah. And it's capitalized typically.
I've always thought the maroon meant a mixture of colors of black and red of it, Indians, so it became maroon.
No, when I say no, I mean I by no means mean to say someone hasn't said that before, like along the way that's how they understood the word. But when it comes to sort of the world of people talking about marooning that I'm privy to, right? We also have marooning for Robinson Crusoe type scenarios, right? In this case, it's got this sort of linguistic history that comes from the original meanings, right? So what I can attest to is somewhere in 1700, somebody might have taken it this way to mean this or that, like along the lines you're saying, or many others. But as far as it goes, yeah, it's really got its roots in that sort of the core idea is sort of you can't control them, right? Which translating to, right, running away from enslavement, which was a system of control among many things, right? It follows a bit there. And colonialism as well, the colonial pressure and oppressions and control on human bodies and communities, right? And people remove themselves from them, right? You can see where it might apply, for sure. Anyway.
I think we're going to stop it there.
Okay.
Dr. Sayers will be signing books, so if you have additional questions, maybe while you get the
I'm
book
here.
signed, you can go ahead and ask those questions. But I do want to make sure we get our raffle done so that.
All right.
Here, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, so let's do this, get right to this raffle, I'm gonna mix things up here. And then I think everybody signed up for this, so if someone is not here, we're just gonna choose another name. But come on and pick up your book after we're done here, but go ahead and pick a couple names here.
This is fun.
No pressure.
All right. Got it. I think it's one. Reading glasses.
Wait, hold on. Got him.
Damn.
Oh,
All
I
right.
do have one.
I think we're good. Is it Dolce?
It only takes 2 archaeologists to
there you go.
to read one label.
Dolce Eves?
Oh, thank
There you
goodness.
go.
Yeah, that Billy is, okay. Well, I'm just gonna give her the book, so go ahead and pick it up.
All right. I'm gonna dig deep. There's one. Not looking. I'm also dropping. All right. Elizabeth Goodwin. Yay!
Well, let me thank Dr. Sayers one more time and all of you for attending today. What a great turnout. We will be doing a book signing, as I said, and there are books for purchase in our gift shop if you are interested. But this is the last of our, at least lecture series for this Black History Month series. We do have a couple of other things coming up later in the year, and so check us out on Ports Events, Ports VA Events, I believe is what it is, .com, or on social media for what else we have coming up. Thank you.
Thank you all.